There's a kind of, you know, recurrent amnesia around the fact that films about women can do well in the box office, films about women can draw over half the population of filmgoers. And actually some guys might even be interested in stories about women, you know, newsflash.
It has happened.
It has happened.
Hi, I'm Kim Taylor-Bennett, and welcome to this episode of Vice Talks Film. Today I'm joined by director Todd Haynes, the man responsible for films like Far From Heaven, I'm Not There, and Velvet Goldmine. But we're going to be talking about Carol, a critically acclaimed film that stars Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara. Todd, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So this film was a bit different. Historically, you tend to write your own scripts, and actually Sandy Powell, who's the costume designer you've worked with extensively, came to you. And what did she say when she brought you this project?
She said, there is a frock film coming up. And
I love that she called it
right?
that.
And she mentioned this Patricia Highsmith novel that I'd never heard of before. That was a lesbian love story, and that Cate Blanchett was attached to play the leading role. So immediately my curiosity was piqued.
And was Rooney your first choice?
I've been watching Rooney Mara's work over the years, as so many of us have, and just been so impressed by the way she handles these extremely intense, often pathological characters that she's played, and does it with such subtlety. So I just thought, wow, what if she played somebody like us? Somebody who we could all really relate to, somebody who was really kind of coming into focus to herself and to the viewer of the movie as we watch it unfold over really a course of 5 months. Her relationship with her boyfriend, Richard, played by Jake Lacey, the advances she gets from another friend and colleague, played by John Magaro. Her temporary job at Frankenberg's department store, inspired by Bloomingdale's, and ultimately her meeting Carol and following and pursuing that relationship. That all these things are kind of operating separately from each other,
yeah,
you know, on separate pistons, and that you slowly start to see decisions and a way of discovering a path, forging a path through all of these things in the course of the film.
And Patricia Highsmith, I guess, based this story on a Christmas that she was a shop girl.
It was just the tip of the iceberg that she actually experienced in her life. Patricia Highsmith, who'd already had relationships with women by the time she was in her early 20s, I think there was a man who'd proposed to her. She liked him very much. They were trying to make a go of it, but he didn't feel right. She wanted to pay for psychoanalysis and try to figure this out, what was wrong with her. And she couldn't afford it, even after selling her first novel, Strangers on the Train, to Alfred Hitchcock to get made into a film. Not quite a audacious debut. So she tempt for a Christmas season at Bloomingdale's in the toy floor behind the doll counter. And one day, this extremely attractive older woman, very well turned out, blonde, with a mink coat, comes over and asks her for help in purchasing a gift for her daughter. And then right afterwards, literally that day, she started to feel sick, feverish. She, I think, got a very serious case of the chicken pox. She may have even been hospitalized briefly. But in this fever state, she conjured this story. What would happen if I met this woman and we continued to get to know each other and our lives began to open up to each other? And that became The Price of Salt. And so this was her very second novel. The publisher of Strangers on a Train were scared of it. Finally, and agents, I think, persuaded her that a small press publication and a pseudonym was in order for something of this content. And so she did. She published it as Claire Morgan, The Price of Salt, and it really made a huge impact on underground lesbian fiction.
I wanted to talk about love, because I always want to talk about love. But this is your first kind of really romantic film. Did it make you reflect on your own relationships and like falling in love for the first time and your kind of feelings in that moment?
Completely, utterly. It's really the thing, I think, that was the absolute motor drive for wanting to do this, aside from wanting to work with Kate again. That novel really put me back in that really unique place that we forget about, I think, sometimes as we get older. Falling in love with people and filling journal pages with the analysis of every moment spent with them and what it might mean. Carol has its own pace. Every movie kind of has its own pace and rhythm and style. And it's maybe not the pace for every film goer, but it's the pace of love. It's the pace of waiting that is part of love, where you're also hanging on the phone and waiting for the letter and waiting for the call and waiting for this and waiting for them to appear at the restaurant or where you think you might run into them or whatever it is. Waiting and dealing with time, filling time, is part of that anxiety. You know?
And then also the shifts in power, which are crucial to the film and also crucial to when you're like falling in love with somebody.
Very much. And so it begins where Carol has all the power, and she's also the older person, and she has the marriage that's failing, and she has the custody issues with her daughter, and she has the social status. And Therese is, by comparison, utterly powerless. But what's so interesting is through the course of events in Carol, those dynamics of power shift, and you realize it has everything to do with how you stand in the love relationship and how much you stand to lose and how easily you could be destroyed in being rejected. And that power dynamic ultimately makes a very dramatic shift toward the end of the movie, which I love about the story.
We have to talk about the world that is Carol. There's a lot of shots through windows and, you know, a lot of trains and cars, and I love that your references picked up street photographers from that era, people like Saul LEITER, Vivian Maier. Have you always been a fan of their photography?
I was at Mark Friedberg's one day and he just dropped this book on the table about Saul LEITER color photography, or Saul LEITER color, I think it's called. And it was such a revelation to me. So I did not know that work until fairly recently. And what was so interesting about Saul LEITER is it showed you these specific moments and places and times of day, you know, where you felt like you were more sitting right there in a New York City cafe, looking out at the snow through the diffusion or the precipitation or the dust on the window and the glass. And you felt more like you were really there at the time than you would be if you saw some big, wide shot that looked down blocks and blocks of the street.
Yeah.
So it gave us this practical way, a creative sort of, you know, directive of how to facilitate that with a limited budget. But what was really cool is while doing the research for this very unique, very specific point in early 1950s America, early 1950s New York, I discovered all these other photographers. And they were people like Ruth ORKIN, HELEN, LEVITT, ESTHER, BUBLEY, who were all shooting color photography at the time. It was just so interesting that it was all these women behind the lens. In addition to SAUL LEITER's extraordinary and unique body of work, there were all these women also working in the color medium. And because Therese in the film, in Carol, as opposed to the book, was an aspiring photojournalist, it also echoed the process that she undergoes in getting comfortable behind the lens.
You have mentioned several times that this was a low-budget film, and that, you know, there was some struggle to get it financed. But what I find interesting about it is not that it was hard to get it financed because it was a gay love story, but because it was starred two women. But time and time again, you come back to women being the central, they're like your muse more than anything. So you're kind of always having to deal with this struggle with studios, right?
I am. It's a recurrent struggle. It's not as if financiers say that to you verbatim.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well, they're not allowed.
They're not allowed, and there's a silent, coded, constantly shifting algebra of what makes any film viable or worth investing in at this moment versus that moment. And unfortunately, there's a kind of you know, recurrent amnesia around the fact that films about women can do well in the box office, films about women can draw over half the population of filmgoers, and actually some guys might even be interested in stories about women, you know, newsflash.
It has happened.
It has happened. If anything, for me, stories that we often characterize as women's stories are stories about love and families and marriages and kids and custody and divorce and real life, basically. So to me, that's always excited me as subjects for film and made me feel like I can speak about things that touch us and we have relevant experiences to get into as an audience, you know? And maybe they're just, if you want to make a sweeping generalization, they're maybe a little less escapist by nature, women's films, stories about women. And there's room for escapist cinema and adventure cinema and fantasy cinema, and that's awesome. But it's maybe not my favorite or my own preference, and maybe I can contribute something different.
We have to talk about David Bowie, because he's just passed away, and also because, obviously, Velvet Goldmine was about him. Talk to me about who he was to you, or what your first experience was with Bowie or glam rock, and how that kind of has informed your life, because I'm sure it has.
It has. It has in so many ways that it made everything possible for me as an artist, you know, well beyond just the specifics of glam rock or loving that music at a certain time in my life or discovering it. It was more about the way Bowie conducted himself in the world as somebody who brought together experimental, intellectual, aesthetic interests and made them popular and accessible. And put them into a vernacular that we could all have access to, and turn people on to William Burroughs and Jean Genet and John Ritchie and, you know, and Stanley Kubrick, and like so many creative influences that he loved to talk about as being inspirational. We all wanted to learn about too because of him. And he made something radical and experimental feel like that's about my life, you know, that's about me, not something way elite or inaccessible to us. What he did with that in the specificity of rock and roll around glitter rock and around these images of this, you know, androgynous space creature who somehow felt more relevant to a teenager figuring out who they are every day than, you know, any, you know, tough leather-clad version of rock and roll that preceded him, was such a unimaginable feat, you know, and just, and, you know, bringing questions of identity and sexuality into play. Around Velvet Goldmine, there was always, and even from Bowie himself, I have to say, there was a discussion about gayness.
Right, really.
And yeah, just like things that he said about the film afterwards were sort of like, well, yeah, Todd Haynes sort of made it as sort of a gay, you know, kind of put a gay slant on glam rock, and I'm like, oh, I give that full credit for that when you were brilliantly mincing up and down the stage or going down on Mick Ronson's guitar. I think you were the groundbreaker.
Yeah, he's the teaser there.
He is, but what's so fascinating is that he really was, you know, whatever he really did behind closed doors, it was a bisexual imagination that he was putting out there,
yeah.
which makes both straight people and gay people uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because as you were saying, in this very identity politic defined era we're in, where everything has to be a specific category of self that you adhere to, when you mix up those categories and you blur those categories up, it's disquieting.
Yeah.
But it's also where art happens, in the sort of fusion and dissolving of these divisions between genres.
You did want to originally license Bowie's music for Velvet Goldmine, but he was just not having any of it?
He was resistant for whatever reason, and you know, what I really believe is that the film is better as a result, even though it's among my favorite music ever composed, period. I think ultimately the fact that it wasn't Bowie's actual music opened it up,
yeah.
and let it breathe, and also exposed people to music like Roxy Music and Brian Eno's music and
yeah.
and Mark Bolan's music.
When you were doing press for Velvet Goldmine, as far back as 1998, you were saying at the time, where is counterculture now? How is assimilation and acceptance going to affect art? I mean, and that was like ages ago. And now, you know, you're still saying the same thing, and how have things progressed for you? I mean, how do you look at stuff nowadays?
And that's a troubling question, I have to say. I saw that thing on Frontline called Generation Like, which is just about, you know, social digital media and our digital culture, and how much it affects young people and the way that they basically want to become sort of branding mechanisms for corporations, and how much internet approval processes and social media basically help that along. And they asked the kids who were being interviewed on the show, what does sellout mean? Have you ever heard the word sellout?
No, and they didn't know.
They didn't know.
Of course they didn't know, because they probably don't even know who Kurt Cobain is.
Exactly.
Oh,
and
shit.
so this idea of
We're
standing
fucked.
outside the society,
Yeah.
right, and kind of trying to occupy some point of resistance to, at the very least, corporate culture.
Yeah.
And how successful capitalism is sort of in this ultimate fight. You want kids to feel empowered to resist.
Yeah.
And I do think that is harder, and I don't know, and I keep thinking there's going to be a backlash to digital technology, right? It's got to happen.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, people are buying vinyl, and they want to go see the Hateful Eight on 70 millimeter on the screen, and you know, and people are making cassette tapes again. So I think there's places to be surprised, of course.
Yeah.
And I've been very thrilled that Carol has had the kind of reaction it's had this year, because it means that people, I think, when people really dig the movie, they're digging all of the sort of classic kind of languages of cinema. You know, cinematography and the score and the costumes and the style. They're appreciating the power of that medium, and I love that. It makes me feel heartened, of course, that medium has not died. So I think there's all kinds of places to look at for enthusiasm and hope.
Well, Todd, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kim. It was a pleasure. Thank you.